Certainly thankful for everyone's presence. We realize that over the last several months that times have changed a great deal, and our number reflects that, and I suspect a lot of folks as well as ours does. I keep hearing people talk about the new normal, and I hope this is not the new normal. I hope eventually we get back to some semblance of what normal was, and everyone can go back about their business without fear. So hopefully that will happen in the not too distant future. But it kind of brings up a subject. There's something I've been kind of wanting to preach on, and I have given a lot of thought to it. And I don't believe sometimes people really realize what a lot of our problems are related to, and I think they should. I don't know that it will be any great benefit to us to realize where our problem lies unless steps are taken to correct them. But at the same time, I think sometimes it's good at least to kind of understand exactly what our problem is. Our country, and almost every prayer that's uttered here, including this morning, people pray for our country and the problems that we have and strive to correct them. We do have some very serious problems. There's no question about that. Some of them have become recognized in very recent times, and some have been there for some time. The truth is, the problems that we have in our country are problems that are not instant problems. They're not problems that began yesterday. They're not problems that began last week. We have an eroding of things, and that really eventually leads to the problem. You know, if you ever notice when in Florida they have a lot of houses that fall into sinkholes. We have that occasionally in Tennessee, not too much, but in Florida it's a pretty big problem. And you kind of think that you go out there one day and the house falls in, and that was the problem. That really wasn't the problem. The problem was that over a long period of time that changes took place beneath the surface until you get to the point that it can't bear the weight of the house anymore and collapses. And that's kind of what's happened in our country. We have come to a time when terrible things are happening, and we kind of get the impression, why can't it be like it was yesterday? That's because yesterday was simply an extension of years and years of turning away from things that are important and the foundations of our nation being eroded. I kind of thought about this, and I've given it some thought for some time, and I haven't talked about it, but I want to look at the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 1 through 17. I had thought that I had that on the slide, but evidently I didn't, so I looked back through it and thought it was there, but it's not. But at any rate, we can read, so we can go back and look at what's taking place. You know, if you think, what is the major change that has taken place in your lifetime in the United States of America? Now, I don't know about the rest of the world because I don't live there, but I live in the United States, and consequently I kind of understand what has been taking place over the last several years. The first 7 verses of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 have to do with our respect for God. Now, I understand that we hear people say over and over that ours is not a Christian nation, and I understand that. But I also realize that on our coins, we have "In God We Trust." I also realize when we pledge allegiance unto the flag in which it stands, one nation under God, that we are proclaiming that we do have some respect for God. How much? Has it changed? Has it remained static? Do you believe that the respect for God today would be the same as it was in 1900? Well, obviously not. The respect that for God today is not even the same as it was in 2000. And it appears to me that the respect for God is eroding at a pretty tremendous pace. You know, it's interesting also that if you look at when Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He said, to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and soul. Now, it's interesting that in this passage, the first 7 verses talks about God and the respect that we should have for Him. When God spake to the people of Israel from the mountain, He said, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven, or that is in the earth beneath, or is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. You know, what happens when we decide that God's not going to be a part of our society? What happens to us when we decide that we're going to reject God and He's not going to be a part of our society any longer? Well, I think that you can look at what's taking place and you can read the passage, and I know that I've read it a lot here lately, but it's almost necessary because it's such a perfect description. When you look back to Romans chapter 1, Romans 1 talks about when we decide that we're going to eliminate God from our thinking, what the result of that will be. He says they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. When that happened, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. Reprobate simply means a mind void of judgment. And so as a result of that, because they decided that they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, and God gave them over to a life without judgment, their life began to be filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful. Boy, that's a horrible society, isn't it? You are very fortunate to live in Marshall County, Tennessee. This morning I heard a woman on the news who lives in New York City talking about last week. One morning she got up to go to work, and she goes to work at 3 in the morning. And she said that she always now cracks the door very slowly and looks outside to see if it's safe to go out. And said the first thing she saw when she cracked the door was this fellow, about 6'4", big old guy, walking down the street completely naked. Didn't have a stitch of clothes on, just marching down the street. She thought, well, you know, he's naked, but maybe he's not a danger to me. So then she looked back up the street, and she saw another big fellow walking down the street, and he was carrying a piece of 2x4, which I don't know exactly what he had intent to do with it, but I suspect I could understand. That's kind of the way people are living in many places today, and the reason is pretty simple. I mean, read what it said. Read what happens when you decide that you don't want to retain God in your knowledge. I've been preaching for years and making a statement, and most people just kind of blow it off as if it's not important and say, oh, that's just really doesn't matter. We began now about somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or 80 years ago in our nation down the road of teaching in all public schools, and the vast majority of our people are taught in public schools, that man is the product of just an accidental occurrence, which went through an evolutionary process that brought us to the point that we're at now. And we're told over and over again that there is no spiritual side to man. That the only thing that man is an animal, just like a cow in the field, a hog in the pen, or a dog on the leash. Now, what kind of things do cows in the field, hogs in the pen, dogs on the leash do? Well, that's what men are doing. That's what men are doing. I mean, you look at a city, when they go in and burn the city down, and really the whole point is that they can run into a store and steal a television set. It's the same as a dog saying, I want that bone, I'm going to take it, and I don't care. And why do you think that's happening? Because we don't like to retain God in our knowledge. I even heard, not during this present election cycle, but in the previous election cycle, a person make the statement on national television in an interview that said that any person who believes in God is not qualified to be the President of the United States. Now, I'm telling you, if you don't think that we have a problem, and it's a lot deeper than just something that our Congress can solve, because they really cannot. Because here is the problem. We don't like to retain God in our knowledge, and when that happens, when it says God gives them over to a reprobate or a life without judgment, it very simply means that they're going to do whatever they please. In the Old Testament, in the book of Judges, chapter 21 and verse 25, at the end of that book, the people had gotten weaned away from the tabernacle and no longer went to it. And the people at this point had not gotten a king as of yet. And so everybody's just kind of doing something that is described here, and it almost looks like the United States today. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Let me ask you something. Did you see on the news the story in Seattle when they established a community, refused to allow any policemen into the community, and said they were going to basically self-govern and everybody could do what they wanted to do. So what you saw was a lot of drug addicts and drunks. They even had 2 murders there and refused to allow the police in to investigate the murder. Now, is that not exactly what he said in the book of Judges? Every man did that which is right in his own eyes. That's exactly what's going on. Why? Well, you hear people offering all kinds of big, flowery statements, and you hear people, some of them are saying, well, if we eliminate all police force, we wouldn't have any crime. And then you hear others say, oh, well, if we would just let everybody take whatever they wanted, because that's actually just reparations for their mistreatment in the past, that'll cure everything. I've heard such ridiculous statements out of people's mouths that I can't believe that anybody would be foolish enough to make a statement and not think that folks would laugh them to shame. Why? Because everybody does what's right in their own eyes. However, sometimes things change. There was a news story where the mayor of Portland, in fact, I saw it, went down to egg the people on as they were trying to burn the federal courthouse. Then they turned on him and showed up at his door, and things changed. But we need to realize that the problem is a problem, and it's a problem because of the fact that people have completely forgotten who God is. And now we've decided that the same people who created the mess that we have, that these are the wise individuals that we're going to turn to solve the problem, even though we won't admit what the real problem is. Just think for a moment. In the book of Job, there are 2 statements. I read them a lot. One is Job 38, verse 2, where God asked this question of Job: who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? The second statement is made in the 40th chapter in verse 1 and 2. The Lord answered Job and said, Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Now God has given you the answer to the problem. And the problem, and the only answer to the problem, is some recognition of God and some recognition that we are responsible to Him and some recognition that there's a higher power than man and some recognition that we can't secure the answers unless we turn to Him. If that doesn't happen, then you can forget it. The problem will not be solved. The problem is that we decided to leave God out of the equation. And when you do that, you pay a terrible, terrible price. Perhaps one of the things this week that illustrated the degradation that's taken place, and you may or may not have seen this, a lot of news media hasn't carried it. The little boy in North Carolina riding his bicycle in the yard, next door neighbor, been a next door neighbor for 8 years. Last week had actually eaten a meal with the family in question, walked out of his front door and took a firearm and shot the young 5-year-old boy in the head and killed him. Can you imagine that? Why do you think that happened? Is it because of poverty? Well, he lived in a pretty good neighborhood, about as good as mine. I hadn't shot anybody in the head yet. I mean, the real problem was that we just have relinquished any sense of God, which takes away all morality and ethical behavior. And until we get it back, then we have a serious problem that will not be corrected, because we don't have the capability to correct it without turning to the proper source. But then we want to turn to something else. This is how I started out going to look at this, but then I decided to go back up to verse 1 through 7. I want to look at the beginning of verse 12. Well, actually beginning in verse 8, I'm sorry. One of the problems that we have is that there is a deliberate attempt to undermine the traditional family. I read something on television the other day that just staggered my mind. It got taken down after, I'm not sure, 1 day or 2 days. But it had a museum in Washington, D.C. And it was a museum of black history. And in it, it had a statement that said that one of the problems that the black community had was that people were looking down upon them because they didn't have traditional family units, and that traditional family units were no longer useful in the modern age. Well, they took that down. They decided that wasn't a very good and smart thing to say. But let me tell you the truth. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Now, in the New Testament, that's repeated. And in the New Testament, He actually tells us in chapter 6 and verse 2 of the book of Ephesians that that is the first commandment with promise. In today's world, one of the biggest problems that we have, and nobody wants to acknowledge it because we like the way that our world is going, that you can live with anybody you want to live with, you can marry anybody you want to marry, you can not ever get married if you don't want to, and if you get tired of this when you move to that one, and you have all those problems. As I told you one time, I was at a ball game at Cornersville, this small town, USA. And they introduced the families of the people, and I counted it. They introduced 6 people as the parents of this boy. 6 people are introduced as the parents of this boy. Now, how many parents does he have? He has 2. Where did the other 4 come from? It come from our disrespect for the family unit and ignoring the truth. Confused that poor kid was by the time he graduated from high school and thought he had 6 parents. You know, we've just undermined it. And we've tried to ignore the result of that. We've tried to pretend that any system that we cook up will be sufficient to take the place of what God instituted, and that is a man and a woman get married and have kids and raise them. and the kids subject themselves to the power and authority of those parents. But somehow, that pillar of our society has been pulled out. Now, when you pull out the pillar of a society, now there's sometimes going to be exceptions to the rule. I understand that. But that's not what we've done. We've created a nation that's just about forgotten the pillar completely, and we just removed it and pretended it doesn't exist, and we wonder why we have a problem. What's the problem? Second thing is this, talking about the pillar of society. I've made this statement many times, and I don't make any apology for it. I believe that a person who would kill an unborn child would do anything. Period. There are no limits to the extent that they can go in their misbehavior. I mean, when I look at a child, if you can mistreat that child, unborn or born, then you don't have any, that word implacable, that you can't be touched with anything in Romans chapter 1, verse 31, it applies to you. You don't have any concept of humanity. Now, in today's world, you wonder, well, why are those people up in Seattle, or in Portland rather, Seattle at that particular time, why didn't they get upset because somebody got murdered? Well, so what? How many people in the United States are killed every day by abortion? I don't know, but it's an enormous number. 250,000 a year approximately, just divide it up. We have absolutely no respect for human life. The Ten Commandments said, thou shalt not kill, based upon the principle in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, that respect for human life is the basis of our society. And if we remove it, then we can forget it. And yet, you're looked upon in today's world as being totally, you don't believe in gay marriage if you're a Christian. You don't believe you ought to be able to divorce for any reason you want. You don't believe that you have the right to abortion. Oh, you people are just kind of products of I don't know what. You're just out of touch. Well, if I'm out of touch, then I just have to plead guilty. The fact is, when you start removing these pillars from society, and you see a woman run up with a baseball bat and start clobbering a New York policeman in the head, you wonder why? Did she intend to kill him? Well, absolutely, certainly so. Why? And then you think of this. Sexual misconduct. He talks about thou shalt not commit adultery. You do realize that if you watch a movie, almost no movie will not have some type of illicit sexual material in it. You know why? You know why? I've heard some movie makers talk about this, because if you don't get it rated at least PG-13 and you don't have a sex scene in it, then it kind of becomes mundane. Nobody will even watch it. That's not a great commentary on our society to say if you don't produce a filth, folks are not interested. But that's kind of what's happening. I mean, God said not commit adultery, which is another protection for the family unit, because adultery there is really addressed to married folks. And He's saying that's the means by which you secure the traditional family unit, but now we just celebrate it. I remember not too long ago, can't remember how many years ago it was, the Episcopal Church in the United States had a major split. The split had to do with homosexuality. Part of them wouldn't go for it, but a lot of them, largest majority, did. And they had a fellow that was married and had some kids, lived up in the eastern seaboard somewhere. Can't remember which state. But at any rate, the news media celebrated him because of his honesty in coming out and joining into a homosexual relationship with this man, even though he had a wife and kids at home. But he was thought to be just a great hero. Tell him we don't have some problems. The reason I chose 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 9 is this. I want you to look at the list. First he says, know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God. And then he begins to enumerate them. Fornicators, idolaters are mentioned, and probably together because fornication was a part of their religious expression in the city of Corinth. But then it goes on to say, adulterers, effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, both descriptions of homosexual behavior. And what he's saying in those passages is that it's something that's detrimental. I mean, there's so many things that you could say. All this praising of homosexuality that takes place. You do realize, I saw the statistic the other day. I think if you even count as homosexuals relationships as being marriage, but just for a moment, just say, okay, it's marriage. You know what the divorce rate in the homosexual community is compared to the rest of society? About 300% greater. I also saw one night on the First 48 a policeman in St. Louis, Missouri. I've never seen that episode again. They probably banned it from television. That said that the murder rate in the homosexual community is about 300% greater than the murder rate in the straight community. But you have to kind of realize something. Once you throw away the basic principle that I'm a man or I'm a woman because I was biologically born that way, and you pretend that's not so, it's bound to be right confusing. And the next thing that happens is you confuse everything and you don't know what's right and wrong because you've just completely thrown out, as they sometimes say, the baby with the bathwater. Pillars of society. Personal property right. I mean, a lot of people look at this thing. I watched a TV show this week. Woman in Chicago. She owns a small gift shop. Back in May, they had a lot of riots, and people came in and tore the doors down, tore the building apart, and stole everything she had. So she gets it all and gets her insurance money, I guess, and whatever else she can put into it. She opened back up. Best I can understand, she was open one day. You know what happened the day that she opened? The rioters came again, tore the doors off the building, stole everything she had. Now, I don't know exactly what she's going to do now. If it's me, I'd move to somewhere else. It wouldn't be there. But here's the point. A lot of people think that's not something that God regulates. You think God doesn't regulate your personal property rights? When the Ten Commandments say, thou shalt not steal, that regulated personal property rights. I don't have a right to anything that belongs to you. Period. And you don't have a right to anything that belongs to me, and there are no exceptions to the rule. In the book of Acts chapter 5 and verse 4, God stated what personal property rights are in a very clear statement made to Ananias, who was pretending that he was giving the entire purchase price of a property to God, but wasn't. But God gives us a perfect picture of personal property rights. God asked a question. Whilst it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was not it in thine own power? Why hast thou conceived this thing in thine heart, and lied not unto men but unto God? Talking about he sold it, pretended it was the whole purchase price. What God said is, that's your personal property. You do with it whatever you want to do. And I don't have any dictates over that. I can't make a decision. You know, we ride by houses sometimes. Pat looks at them and they're really in a state of disrepair, and she just talks about what a shame that is. But people live there on it. They do whatever they please. Of course, one thing that does change that sometimes, if you have a lien on your house, you don't own it. The bank does. So they might come out and tell you, you can't let this place fall to the ground, you got to fix it. But that's because they own it. You don't own it. In reality, until that lien is satisfied. But generally speaking, people do whatever they please. I remember a fellow one time in Kentucky. He and his wife got a divorce, and the judge dictated they would divide all property in half, and he took a chainsaw and sawed his house in half. He didn't have a mortgage on it. They tried to prosecute him. They couldn't. Because it's his. But if I went over and sawed his house in half, that'd be a different story, because it's not mine. Personal property rights are an act of God. What belongs to me belongs to me, and you don't have a right to it. And people in this country have undermined that pillar. They don't even respect that anymore. And telling the truth, this morning in class, that they used to say, didn't believe anything you hear and only half what you see. But now you have all the photoshopping and all the video modification. And so you can't believe that either. I see things, I mean, how many times have you read, if you're on Facebook, you know what I'm saying. How many times have you looked on Facebook and seen something, and then later you find out that was a hoax? You thought, well, that's crazy. Well, it was, because it wasn't true. But it was modified so as to make it look so. God said, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And one of the things that's done in this situation quite often, in this political scene that we have today, people, pardon the expression, used to say when I was a kid, lying through their teeth every day to secure what they want and think it's all right because actually, after all, they're seeking an end that's to be desired, so whatever they have to do to achieve it, they're fine with it. Has that ever been done before? Well, when Jesus was crucified, the chief priests and the elders, in verse 59 of Matthew 26, the chief priests and the elders, they sought counsel. What counsel? They sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death. They're going to lie for the purpose of securing something they consider to be important, and that is getting rid of him. In this country today, how many times do you see that? How many times do you see people lying through their teeth, and they know it, but they believe it's all right? Because after all, we're trying to achieve something that needs to be done. And you know what? When they couldn't find one, they kept on, and they brought in a whole lot of them, and they finally found two that came in and said, this fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple and to build it in 3 days. But that's not what he was talking about, and they knew it wasn't, but it didn't make any difference. How many times do you hear that today? How many times do you see people just telling outright, bold-faced lies, and you know it? But there's all kind of folks just believe it, suck it in, just follow right along after it. If we keep doing that, then we've got a serious problem, because that's one of the pillars of our society. Last thing I want to come to is this. That last point is so meaningful. He said, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his maidservant, nor his manservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that's thy neighbor's. Now, it goes back to that idea of personal property as well as family relationships and a lot of things. But it has to do with one particular thing, and that's envy. In our country, what's all these problems coming from? People standing up and say that you've been mistreated and you deserve better, and so therefore you can do whatever you please. Isn't that right? Isn't that true? What is it? It's just plain envy. Covetous of what... I walked through the living room this morning, just walked through, and I heard this woman speaking. She had a megaphone. She's standing in the middle of a subdivision, and she's yelling at the neighbors, and she said, you're going to have to get out of your property and leave because we're going to take it. Can you imagine that? Why? What do you think the problem is? Romans 13, in verse 13, says something that people really need to pay a little attention to, and especially in the context. Romans 13 is a passage that deals with civil authorities being God's instrument to produce order on the earth. And in verse 13 he said this, let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, nor in chambering and wantonness, nor in strife and envying. Let me tell you something. Look around you. Just look at it and see what you see. You see envy. You see rioting. You see all the things that he describes. The principles enumerated in the Ten Commandments were the foundation upon which our country was built. Now, if you look at our laws, I don't care what they are. Our laws up into modern times were all based upon those few principles. Those few principles of truth were kind of the cornerstone. Now, let me say something here that I want you to pay attention to. You know, in the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is a great prophet because he lived in a time in a nation like ours that lost its way and had basically rejected God, had kind of turned to their own devices, and they were doing whatever they pleased. And there's a description of that in chapter 30. And here's what he said, verse 12. And I don't know, it's not a very encouraging thought. But then there is some encouragement added. Thy bruise is incurable. Thy wound is grievous. There is none to plead thy cause. There's no excuse for your behavior. But thou mayest be bound, that thou mayest be bound up, that thou hast no healing medicines. I mean, all that we see going on, and we see people talking about how they're going to solve this. There's this story about the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is we've ignored God and we're reaping the whirlwind, and that's the truth. He says, all thy lovers have forsaken thee, they seek thee not. For I have wounded thee with the wound of an enemy, with the chastisement of a cruel one. For the multitude of thine iniquity, because thy sins were increased. Why criest thou for thine affliction? Thy sorrow is incurable for the multitude of thine iniquity, because thy sins were increased. I have done these things unto thee. One of the things that amazes me the most is a group of people will get together in a riot, burn down every store on the street, and then the next day they're interviewed by a reporter and they'll say, well, I don't know what we're going to do. We ain't got a place to buy groceries. Well, why hadn't you? Because you burnt the store down. You don't realize that? Don't you see that in what Jeremiah said? Everybody wants to say, oh, it's somebody else's problem. No, it's not. And when sometimes people will say to me, and I've been hesitant to preach a lesson like this one for this reason. People say, but you know, Israel was the chosen people of God and we are not. That is so. Despite what you hear people say, the United States of America is not the chosen people of God. It was established upon godly principles. It's the best nation in the world as far as I'm concerned. No comparison to any of them. But we're fast losing that designation because we are turning away from the only thing that made us great in the first place. I want to read to you something that's stated in Proverbs 14 because this is talking about any nation. This is not just talking about the people of God. This is talking about any nation, any group of people, any community, anywhere. A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy the rottenness of the bones. He that oppresseth the poor reproacheth his maker, but he that honoreth him hath mercy on the poor. The wicked is driven away in his wickedness, but the righteous hath hope in his death. Wisdom resteth in the heart of him that hath understanding, but that which is in the midst of fools is made known. And then he said, talking about any nation you want to describe, whether it be Israel, Judah, or the United States of America, or Germany, or England, or whatever, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. In the 1960s, there were a lot of things that made me ashamed of my country. In the 2020s, there have been many of the same things, almost identical. If you lived in the 60s, you realize that when you watch the news today, you see almost exactly the same thing you saw then. You kind of think, did we not learn a thing out of that? Didn't we learn anything? We have a blueprint to success. But everybody wants to be the one that comes up with the answer, and nobody wants to take the one that makes sense. Just do the right thing. Just accept the fact that God has the answers and that God's authority needs to guide us. And that's the only thing that will help. I don't care what else you do. You know, here's the problem. Congress, not long ago, spent $3 trillion. Can you imagine? Do you even know what $3 trillion is? Can you even imagine that? I don't even know the numbers to tell you what it is because it's so staggering that I can't even conceive of it. And now they're talking about adding another $1 trillion It won't solve the problem. It won't solve the problem. Until there comes some semblance of our understanding that we're created by God and we have to act in accord with that, the problem's going to keep on just like it is. I wish that somehow folks would come to their senses and say, you know what? I was created by God, and He has given me some guidelines, and if I just follow them, then everything will work out pretty good. We're going to sing a song of encouragement, not preach a first principle lesson. I'm sure that you would agree that that's true. Have talked about things that I think we as Christians need to be concerned about, need to understand a little bit. One of the things that is a real problem in this situation as well as any other is lack of hope. Lack of hope. We kind of give up and decide, well, nothing can be done to solve it. But you know, in the final analysis, the only thing that solved the problem with Judah was God destroyed them. I hope He doesn't have to go to that extent with the United States of America, but He can if He has to. And will He? Well, you know, it's like the two boys I tell you about sometimes came to the wise man, had a bird in his hand, and said, is it alive or dead? He said, the answer's in your hands. The answer's in our hands. People in the United States can wake up and smell the roses and act like decent folks, and we can solve the problem, or we can keep acting like a bunch of heathens, and we're going to destroy ourselves. People need to realize it. Now, I know you say, oh, we got an audience of 30-something people. What difference does it make? But understand one thing. We have to control ourselves, because outside of ourselves, we're the only person we control. Boy, I wish a lot of folks could get a control of themselves and we'd go in a different direction. Going to sing us home encouragement. Need to respond to the gospel. We encourage you to, so as together we stand as we sing.